Serious. What is the unexplained, creepy, scary story that always gets told in your family gatherings? Part 1. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. My cousin Emily was born in 2000, my grandpa died in 2002. One day she was playing, 3 years old, talking on her little toy phone and she started laughing. My aunt asked her what was so funny and she said, "Papa told me about when there was a bird in this house and he had to get it out with a broom." Which was funny because that did happen when my grandparents stayed at her house when my aunt was in the hospital ready to deliver her. I know I'm really late to this thread, but my great-grandma was a psychic. Not the gimmicky type either, but a real honest-to-goodness one. One of the ones that sticks out the most is when she woke up in the morning from a dead sleep, gasped, and yelled to her husband, "Turn on the radio. There was just a train crash and 30 people died." Great-grandpa turns on the radio, and at that exact moment is the announcer telling the news about the tragedy. I have a few more if anyone would like to hear them. I hope I'm not too late. My dad's aunt lived in Ohio. Another generation of the family lived there before her. One of the family members killed himself in the basement many years before. One day at a get-together, one of the kids was downstairs in the basement playing and the adults could hear him talking to someone. I'm not exactly sure how it all unfolded, but it turns out that when he was asked who he was talking to, he said the dead man's name, whom he had never met, and described him perfectly. 2 stories from my mum's cousins, Mary, house in rural Ireland. Like most houses in this part of rural Ireland, Mary's house was a detached, single-story property situated on a large plot of land with a long, unlighted path up to the property. Mary's neighbors were a good 10 to 15 minutes walk away and the nearest town was a 15-minute drive away. This alone can be unnerving to those unfamiliar with the countryside. However, this house always had an uneasy vibe about it. You could be sat in the living room watching TV and have a bizarre feeling, not necessarily someone watching you, but definitely an uneasy one. I digress. On the day in question, Mary was in the front room hoovering and cleaning. She had full view of the pathway leading from the main road up to the house. As she was working away, she noticed 2 men in suits walking up the path. A little strange as they were on foot, but Mary assumed they were relatives, visitors of a nearby neighbor. Mary went to the door to greet the men, but they were nowhere to be seen. Surely, they would have been by the door at this point or at least walking up to the door. Strange. Mary closed the door and walked through to the back to the kitchen to see if they had come by the back door. Mary didn't have to open the door to see the 2 men walking up the hill at the back of her house. Very bizarre scene as they were in suits and walking towards an area that was completely deserted. Second story. My family personally experienced something strange at the same property. My parents were staying in the master bedroom at the front of the property. My grandmother was staying in the other bedroom at the front. My eldest sister was staying in a bedroom at the back with her friend and myself, and my other 2 sisters stayed in the 4th room by the kitchen. We had all been asleep for several hours when we were suddenly jolted awake by my eldest sister's screams followed by her friends. We all rushed out into the living room. All bedrooms were joined up by this room, with my dad running to my sister. She claimed that they were woken up by a tapping on their bedroom window, followed by a light from a torch beaming into their room. My father, a great beast of a man, went around the property ready to confront whoever it was. Strangely, my dad was unable to find anyone and we never experienced anything for the remainder of our stay. Mom is from Nepal, family is Hindu. When someone dies in the family, it's customary to not celebrate or throw any parties for a month after death. One year my mom's great aunt dies. Family decides to celebrate some holiday. All the kids are in a room away from the adults watching a movie when they hear a knock on the door. They open the door and see the dead aunt just smiling at them with a creepy smile on her face, holding a glass of water. Then she just shrinks and shrinks until she disappears and the glass falls and smashes. This story is still told today and there were like 25 eyewitnesses, some of whom are super serious people in real life who normally wouldn't make stuff like this up, so, kinda freaky. There's a story about my great-grandfather. He was heading home from church on evening. He was on a cart being pulled by a horse and he was alone. As he got close to home, he noticed someone walking in an overgrown area full of weeds. He called out to the person and they stopped walking and seemed to turn to him. They began walking towards him and as they came out of the cover he saw that they didn't have a head. His horse started to panic and he started freaking out. As he took off in the cart, the headless person started running at him and followed behind him until he was out of sight. He refused to ever go back that way again. I'll tell the one from my papa, grandfather, as that one is the scariest, but there's more if anyone is interested. Back in the mid-1960s, 1965 if I remember the dates correctly, my papa, 18 at the time, his younger sister, her fiancé and a friend we'll call Mike, decided to mess with the Ouija board Mike had gotten. According to my papa, no one believed in it. Even though my papa's family were quite religious, they didn't believe that a spirit or demon could really manifest through a toy. They got to playing, asking the usual stuff, we all know the drill. Suddenly his sister asked, "When will I die?" And it spelled out, "Soon." My papa didn't think it was very funny that Mike was trying to scare her. His sister egged it on, asking for different details and specifics until finally the board spelled out 19, and train. They all scoffed. There weren't any trains near their town and they left their town maybe once a year. They call it quits and forget about it. Fast forward a few months, October 19th of that year. My papa's sister was surprised by a gift from her fiancé with a trip to a large nearby city to see a show. Later that night, the police informed my papa's family that there had been an accident. The fiancé had tried to beat the train. They assumed this. There were no witnesses, but they assumed if they were stuck, they would have at least tried to get out of the car. And it had been hit, killing them instantly. I found all this out for the first time when I was 6 and asked my papa if we could get a Ouija board like the one we saw on the paranormal ghost show we were watching. Edit. This one is my Mima's grandmother, and is more explainable and weird than spooky or scary, and it's worth noting that my Mima's side of the family believe very heavily in the significance of dreams. She swears she saw my son's future, before he was even conceived. When I was 18, I had just moved to a new state with my husband. She called me one day to tell me that she had had a dream the night before and she just knew she had to tell me, not why, just that she did. She dreamed that she was in a large room, almost like an auditorium or a college lecture hall, that type of thing. She looked up and there was a man on a podium, his picture light up on the wall behind him. She said he had dirty blonde hair and dark eyes, he was handsome and he was speaking, but strangely enough she couldn't hear him. Everyone else seemed to be listening intently, but no matter what, she could only hear silence. Suddenly the picture behind him changed and it changed to the phrase, "Great One," and the dream ended all at once. We disregarded it for years. Then I had my son. At 3 years old, my son was not only diagnosed with nonverbal autism but also Savant syndrome. His case presents as perfect memory and high IQ, estimated to be at about 130. His name means Great One. We didn't know this when we named him. We lived on a farm for a while in Ireland, well out in the middle of nowhere, just outside of Ballymahan in Co. Westmeath. As the story goes, a man used to come home every night to the house he lived in with his mother. He'd come down the road, come in the back door, go down the hall and into the kitchen, and then pull out a chair to sit at the table and have something to eat before going to bed. From her bed, his mother heard him repeat the exact same pattern every night. The last night though, after she heard the door, the steps and the sliding chair in the kitchen, the man was found dead the next morning, hanging from a tree beside the gate to the field he would have crossed as a shortcut to the last stretch of the road to our home. The gate was left open, by the way, which doesn't make sense because we all kept cattle in that field and they could have easily gotten out. The implication was that he never made it home that night, but his spirit did. My grandparents moved into that house and my mom grew up there. Granny claims she heard the ghost herself a few times, but what really gets everybody upset is that to leave our farm you had to walk down that lonely road and go right past that gate, and many a time it will be open even though you knew there was no way anybody in their right mind would forget to close it behind them. The cattle did sometimes get loose. Believe me, when you're a little kid, and having heard that story a few times, and having to walk down that road alone in the early hours of the morning to go check the cattle didn't wander off, you don't walk past that gate. You run like hell past it. And when you upset a resting flock of birds and they all alight, you scream for all you're worth. Granny might have been pulling our legs, I suppose, but this was Ireland around the 1920 s when the original events took place. They were hard, turbulent times, and she went to mass pretty much every day until she passed away in the 60s. She was as straight-laced and devout a churchgoer as you'll ever meet, and unlikely to have made a prank like this. To this day, some 50 years later, the gate is still there, and so is the tree the man hung himself from. It's an ugly old-looking thing, a perfect hanging tree, and I still get the creeps every time I go back and go past it. I never linger there. Every once in a while the cattle do still get out and block the road, so we have to go out and herd them back, but I've never told any of the kids about the story that might explain how they got out in the first place. My grandmother always tells the story of the man in the yellow coat. He knocked on the door of her and my grandfather's home one day. They were a young couple at the time. He was European, she's not exactly sure what nationality, but he was wearing a yellow coat. Being religious and the kind of people who will always help others, they invited him in for tea, asked him about himself, etc. He wouldn't give much away. The second time he appeared unannounced at the front door. My grandparents already had friends over but invited him to stay anyway. As soon as he came into the room, everyone there started trying to find excuses to leave the room or not look this man in the eyes. One by one everyone left the room until he was the only one left there, and when they talked about it later each person felt an indescribable fear when around this man in the yellow coat, like he had this sinister aura. From then on my grandparents tried to find excuses not to be around him even though he continued knocking on the door from time to time for seemingly no reason. One day my grandmother collected the mail and found a handwritten letter from him saying that he was going to kill them both, my grandparents. That he would not stop even if they cried and begged him to, and how they would both burn in hell. Naturally my grandmother was terrified, and even though he never followed through on his threat, she would occasionally see him walking around town in his yellow coat and remember it all over again. I think he had probably had major issues, but the story gives me the shivers whenever someone brings it up. My dad once traveled through northern Mexico with some of his siblings and their spouses. They stopped somewhere to sleep for one night and had a terrifying encounter. I don't remember what the layout of the room was, but my dad did say that several of the beds were placed next to each other. They used those thick Mexican striped blankets due to the low temperatures up in the mountains. He woke up in the middle of the night and felt the coldest sensation he's ever experienced going down his back before one of my aunts started screaming. Someone turned on the light to find my aunt sitting up and crying in bed. There was a huge chunk of her hair missing. When they looked underneath her bed, they found her hair just lying on the floor. My dad says she was in the middle of the bed, so no one could figure out what happened until she calmed down somewhat. Apparently, she woke up and felt a big hand with long fingernails pulling on her hair. They didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the owner asked the group if they had been by to visit the previous night. Apparently my great-grandmother was an actual witch. When my grandfather was a young boy, my great-grandmother has had enough of my great-grandfather cheating on her. He was a merchant of some sort, going from town to town with an actual carriage, and quite the womanizer. So she cursed him. As my grandfather tells us, he was accompanying his dad on one of his trips. They were driving the carriage, and then all of a sudden a huge creepy white figure appeared right in front of the horses and they went completely mad with fear. My grandfather said she looked like a huge white woman, completely silent, just raised her hands in front of the horses. They tripped over the whole cart. My great-grandfather was killed instantly, and my grandfather broke his leg so badly the bone came through the skin and he had the scar to prove it, but was otherwise okay. My dad always jokingly tells me to make sure every guy the first date knows this story so they won't fuck around, smiley face. My grandmother is getting pretty old now, so she tells this story more often than she used to. In the 60s, she took her 3 young kids and left her abusive husband. The only house she could afford to rent at first was a ramshackle 4-room farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It didn't even have indoor plumbing, just an outhouse and a well out back where they drew water. According to her and my mother, every night around 2 a.m., they would hear the back door into the kitchen unlock and open. It was an old door, and both those actions had very distinctive, unmistakable sounds. They would then hear heavy footsteps walk across the creaky kitchen floor to the water bucket, and the water dipper would rattle against the bucket, like someone was dipping out a drink of water. And then nothing. It scared the shit out of her, of course. But once she ascertained that no one was breaking and entering, so there was no one to shoot, she settled down. In her eyes, whatever was happening, it wasn't harmful. My mom, on the other hand, was the only kid old enough to really understand what was happening, and it freaked her out. So my grandmother decided to get her sister, my great-aunt Sue, to stay over one night. They planned to sit up and see what the hell was going on. My mom wasn't going to join them, but she couldn't sleep and felt safer in the room with them, so she was there as well when 2 o'clock rolled around. They were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when they heard the back door unlock and swing open. The thing is, they were staring straight at it, and it didn't move. Same with the footsteps and the water dipper. They saw nothing, even though they could hear it clearly, even discern the direction of the noises. That was pretty much that. It kept happening every night. They didn't stay in that house long because my grandmother found a job and a better rental closer to town, and my mom was super happy to get out of there. So my grandmother still talks about it sometimes, and it's strangely hilarious, because she's so unbothered by it. I mean, I would pee my pants. But the last time I asked her why it didn't scare her, she said, "Well shit, he was just thirsty." Quote.